Hi students, this will be part 2 of the chapter 14 lecture. I just finished talking about the ventricles of the brain and the flow of cerebrospinal fluid, and now I'm going to be talking a little bit about blood supply and the brain barrier system. So the brain is a very metabolically demanding organ, of course. It's only about 2% of an adult's body weight, but it receives about 15% of the blood, which adds up to about 750 milliliters of blood delivered to the brain every minute. The reason why it's so metabolically active is, of course, the neurons have a very high demand for ATP. ATP, remember, is adenosine triphosphate. It's what our cells use. Basically, you can think of it as a currency that our cells spend anytime they're doing work. So neurons have a very high demand for ATP. ATP is going to be made, remember, in the mitochondria of cells, and oxygen is going to be necessary for the process of aerobic respiration. And then glucose, of course, is going to be your basic sugar that is what plants produce in photosynthesis, and your body can break down all sorts of nutrients and recombine them to make a molecule of glucose, which is C6H12O6. So really high demand for ATP, therefore a really high demand for oxygen, because oxygen drives the production of ATP, and glucose is basically the simplest nutrient that can easily be turned into ATP. So a constant supply of blood is going to be absolutely critical for brain health. Basically, a 10-second interruption of blood flow may cause loss of consciousness. 1 to 2 minute interruption can cause significant impairment of neural function, and then going 4 minutes without blood causes irreversible brain damage. Now, despite the fact that the brain has this huge demand for delivery of nutrients via the bloodstream, there are also a lot of potentially harmful substances that could be delivered in the bloodstream as well. And this is where the brain barrier system comes in. So the brain barrier system basically regulates what substances can get from the bloodstream into the extracellular fluid surrounding the brain, into that tissue fluid. So blood, of course, is crucial, but it can also contain harmful agents like viruses and bacteria. And there are two basically points of entry for blood that must be guarded to safeguard the brain from potential harmful agents within the blood. Those are the blood capillaries that are distributed throughout the brain tissue, and then the capillaries of the choroid plexus. So the choroid plexus, remember, are the fine little networks of capillaries within the ventricles. The ventricles, the third ventricle, fourth ventricle, lateral ventricles, those are just the chambers within the brain that hold the cerebrospinal fluid. They are lined with ependymal cells that produce that CSF, and they provide basically a pathway through which the CSF can flow. So the capillaries of the choroid plexus are going to be protected with what are known as tight junctions of ependymal cells, and the blood capillaries throughout the brain tissue itself are going to be protected via those perivascular feet of astrocytes, which I mentioned when we looked at the glial cell types in the previous chapter. So the perivascular feet of those astrocytes help to stimulate formation of tight junctions within epithelial cells. So what this basically does is you have your blood capillaries, which basically act to filter blood through tissue. And capillaries are very porous, so they essentially have these little openings through which blood can flow through, diffuse through tissue. The astrocytes will have these little perivascular feet that essentially block those openings. So rather than having blood just flow freely through those pores in the capillaries, they have to first go through the cellular structure of the perivascular feet, which is an extension of those astrocytes. So it's basically just an additional method of protecting the brain from potential pathogens. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about parts of the lower brain. So parts of what are known as the brainstem. And remember, there are basically three main parts to the brain. There's going to be your cerebrum, which is what you think of when you think of a brain, is you're thinking of the cerebrum. So this large, complex, highly folded structure here, this is going to be your cerebrum. Then what's known as the little brain, or the hindbrain, is the cerebellum. And then the brainstem is essentially everything that is left over if you were to remove the cerebellum and the cerebrum. So these components of the brainstem is what I'm going to be starting out with, starting with the inferior-most component here, the medulla oblongata, which is oftentimes just referred to as the medulla. So the medulla oblongata derives from the embryonic tissue known as myelencephalon. It begins at the foramen magnum of the skull. I think I mentioned this in a previous lecture, but basically where you have the spinal cord entering the foramen magnum of the occipital bone, once that spinal cord enters the foramen magnum, it becomes the medulla oblongata. And looking at a brain in isolation, it's not like there's going to be this very obvious anatomical landmark that tells you, oh, the medulla oblongata is here and the brainstem is here. It's kind of a gradual tapering. The medulla extends about 3 centimeters rostrally. Remember, rostrally means towards the nose, towards the front. So 3 centimeters rostrally. And in a human, of course, this is adopted from quadruped vocabulary. Basically, it would be more rostrally if we were talking about a quadruped where we had a more of an elongated structure to the brain, but it's essentially going to be superiorly in the human. So it extends about 3 centimeters rostrally or towards the top of the brain and ends at a groove just below the pons. So the pons here is going to be the next segment of the brainstem. It is just slightly wider than the spinal cord, so like I said, there's not really a huge anatomical difference. The differences between the spinal cord and the medulla are apparent when you look at the tissue microscopically and functionally, though. Okay, so various views of the medulla oblongata from Anatomy and Physiology Revealed. So we have a lateral view with a mid-sagittal cut here. And as you can see, this would be the level of the foramen magnum here. So we have our spinal cord, and this first segment here is the medulla. Same view, essentially, without the cranium and vertebral column for context. This is an inferior view, of course, so we have the spinal cord having been cut at this point, and then just superior or rostrally to that, we have the medulla oblongata. Then just a close-up view here. Okay, so the medulla oblongata is a crucial part of the brain because all ascending and descending fibers connecting the brain and spinal cord pass through the medulla, which of course makes sense. So all of the fibers, what are we referring to here? These are going to be the axons of neurons. So all of those fibers that connect the brain and the spinal cord have to pass through the medulla. And I said that makes sense because this is the inferior-most part of the brain. Any signals that are traveling from the peripheral nervous system up to the brain have to pass through the medulla oblongata, and any signals that are passing from the brain out to the peripheral nervous system have to go through the medulla. So ascending means towards CNS. Those are going to be afferent fibers or sensory, and descending are going to be efferent fibers or motor fibers. So the motor fibers for muscles below the neck are going to pass through this region. So all of our skeletal muscles below the level of the neck are going to be passing through this area, and over 90% of those fibers cross over. That's known as a decussation. So decussate means to cross over. We'll be seeing that term a lot more in the coming weeks. That means that the muscles below the neck are controlled by the contralateral, or the opposite side of the brain. So the muscles in your right leg, for example, are actually controlled by the left side of your brain, and vice versa. The medulla also has a structure known as the inferior olivary nucleus. Remember that a nucleus in the context of brain anatomy just means an area where neurons that have a common purpose are concentrated. So this is a relay center for signals from many levels of the brain and spinal cord. And then we also have what's known as the reticular formation, which is a loose network of nuclei. The reticular formation has components throughout the brainstem, not just the medulla, but the components that are in the medulla are the cardiac center, which controls the rate and the force of heartbeat, the vasomotor center for regulating blood pressure, and respiratory centers for the rhythm and depth of breathing. Okay, so looking at a diagram of our medulla oblongata here, we see one of the landmarks is what are known as the pyramids, which kind of look like side-by-side baseball bats here. So these would be the pyramids separated by the anterior median fissure. And then we also see 4 pairs of cranial nerves that I have highlighted here. So vestibulocochlear nerve, part of that nerve, that's also known as cranial nerve number 8. And keep in mind that these are paired nerves, so you see these on either side, and they're only labeled on one side on this diagram. We see the glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve number 9, the vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10, and then the accessory nerve, cranial nerve number 12. Okay, let's look at the pons. So we're proceeding rostrally up the brainstem, essentially. The pons is a little bit more obvious in terms of its differentiation. It's going to be a little bit thicker than the medulla. It's the anterior bulge in the brainstem that's rostral to the medulla, and it develops from the embryonic tissue known as metencephalon. So this structure here is going to be the pons. Posteriorly, there are 2 pairs of thick stalks that are known as the cerebellar peduncles that connect the cerebellum to the pons and the midbrain. So various views of the pons. The pons contains ascending sensory tracts and descending motor tracts, like what we saw in the medulla, and that's, of course, a pattern that will be constant when we're talking about tracts and nerves. The ascending tracts are going to have those afferent or sensory fibers. The descending tracts are going to have those efferent or motor nerves within them. The tracts within the pons are kind of like superhighways for signals being sent in and out of the brain. They are pathways in and out of the cerebellum, and the cranial nerves that we see arising at the level of the pons are 5, 6, 7, and 8. So we have sensory roles involved in hearing, equilibrium, taste, and facial sensations, and then motor roles involving eye movement, facial expressions, chewing, swallowing, urination, and secretion of saliva and tears. And keep in mind that some of our cranial nerves, most of our cranial nerves, are going to be what are known as mixed nerves, meaning they have both sensory and motor roles. They have both afferent and efferent fibers. Some of them are going to be strictly sensory, for example, like the olfactory nerve, but be sure to watch that lecture over the cranial nerve so you'll get a sense of the roles for each of those. And then we have some of the components of the reticular formation within the pons as well, containing additional nuclei concerned with sleep, respiration, and posture. So one of the things that you'll notice as I talk about parts of the brainstem as opposed to the cerebrum, for example, is the lower you go in the brain itself, the more basic the functions. So we've looked at the medulla and the pons so far, and we're seeing some very basic homeostatic mechanisms being controlled here: respiration, blood pressure, posture, sleep and wake cycles. Generally, of course, the higher up you go in the brain, the more sort of advanced the functions get until you reach the cerebral cortex, which is going to be the seat of our conscious thoughts and planning and foresight, and basically what makes us human. Okay, so we're still in the brainstem. Remember our three main parts of the brain: cerebrum, cerebellum, and brainstem. The midbrain is part of the brainstem. The mesencephalon becomes one mature brain structure, and that is the midbrain. It is a short segment of the brainstem that connects the hindbrain to the forebrain. And it contains the cerebral aqueduct, which is part of the ventricular system for the flow of cerebrospinal fluid. It's also surrounded by central gray matter involved in controlling pain, and it contains two cranial nerves that control eye movements: cranial nerve 3, which is the oculomotor nerve, and cranial nerve 4, which is the trochlear nerve. So the midbrain is going to connect the forebrain and the hindbrain. So the hindbrain is essentially your cerebellum. Forebrain is going to be your cerebrum. So we see this little section of tissue right here in the middle being the midbrain that basically serves to connect those two structures. Inferiorly or caudally, we see the pons and then the medulla leading into the spinal cord. So when we do our sheep brain dissections, this structure is even smaller in sheep. It's not going to be very obvious, but you will see the cerebral aqueduct passing through that, which you can see here. This little narrow passage is going to be the cerebral aqueduct. There aren't really clearly defined boundaries between the pons, between the midbrain. So it is just basically going to be using your best judgment and relative positions of other structures to identify where the midbrain is. Okay, so the midbrain has what's known as the tectum. This is a roof-like part of the midbrain that's posterior to the cerebral aqueduct. There are 4 bulges here known as the corpora quadrigemina. The superior colliculi, we have 2 of those, function in visual attention, tracking moving objects, and some of our reflexes. And then the inferior colliculi receive signals from the inner ear and relays those to other parts of the brain, especially the thalamus. And then we have our cerebral peduncles, which are those 2 anterior midbrain stalks that anchor the cerebrum to the brainstem. Each of those has 3 parts: the tegmentum, which serves for fine motor control; the substantia nigra, which relays inhibitory signals to the thalamus to prevent unwanted body movement; and then the cerebral crus, which is going to connect your cerebrum to your pons. All right, so the reticular formation, now I've mentioned this in the context of both the medulla and the pons. So the reticular formation is not a separate structure of the brain per se. It's not easily identifiable anatomically. It's just a loose web of gray matter that runs vertically through all levels of the brainstem. Now remember, there's 2 main types of matter that we see in the brain, gray matter and white matter. The gray matter is going to be basically your neurosomas, the bodies of the neurons, and then the white matter is going to be your myelinated axons of those neurons. So reticular formation is going to be those loose associations of gray matter that run vertically through all levels of the brainstem. So this is illustrated in these red arrows here. We have our ascending general sensory fibers in the spinal cord here. Reticular formation is represented by these red arrows throughout the brainstem. And then what the reticular formation basically does is it sends signals to all parts of the cerebrum. So that's what the blue arrows are illustrating here. That says radiations to the cerebral cortex. That means those signals are going to be traveling to all parts of the brain. So the reticular formation is really important basically to relay signals, having all of those connections with many areas of the cerebrum. And essentially we have more than 100 small neural networks without distinct anatomical boundaries. Functions of the reticular formation networks. Varied functions. We have one of the main ones being somatic motor control, adjusting muscle tension to maintain tone, balance, and posture, especially during body movements. Relay signals from the eyes and ears to the cerebellum, so make sense of what we're seeing and hearing. Integrating visual, auditory, balance, and motion stimuli into motor coordination. We have gaze centers, which allow our eyes to track and fixate on objects. And then we also have central pattern generators, which are neural pools that produce rhythmic signals to the muscles of breathing and swallowing. We also see cardiovascular control being exerted within these networks, cardiac and vasomotor centers of the medulla oblongata, as I mentioned previously. And then we also have some pain modulation occurring here. So pain modulation is basically a way to manage the sensation of pain. So some pain signals ascend through the reticular formation, and then we have some of the descending analgesic pathways beginning in the reticular formation and ending in the spinal cord, where they're going to actually help block transmission of pain signals. So that is part of this pain modulation pathway. We also see sleep and consciousness. The reticular formation plays a central role in consciousness, alertness, and sleep. And I'm not going to be going through different types of brain waves that are seen through different phases of sleep, but that information is within the Saladin textbook after the section on cerebral lateralization, and I highly recommend reading about that because it is absolutely fascinating. And you learn about REM sleep and basically how our brain activity looks different depending on what part of the sleep cycle we're in. So if injury occurs in this part of the reticular formation, you can actually have irreversible coma occur. And then we also have part of the reticular formation serving as helping with this phenomenon known as habituation. So habituation is essentially what happens when you get used to a stimulus that is not really consequential to you. So like if you're living in the city, you're able eventually to block out the sounds of traffic and be able to sleep, for example. You're habituated to those sounds. It's basically a stimulus that your body has learned doesn't really have direct bearing on your health or well-being, so you just kind of learn to tune it out. So the reticular activating system will modulate activity in the cerebral cortex so that you're able to ignore those repetitive, inconsequential stimuli.